All righty. So we are moving into the third and final panel of the day, Detention, Deportation, and Asylum. My colleague and department chair and mentor, Professor Pat Zavella, will be moderating. I will hand the floor over to her.
Thank you, Kat. I'm going to introduce our panelists very quickly and all together at the beginning, so we'll have plenty of time for presentations and for questions and comments at the end. So our first presentation will be by Dr. Leisy Abrego, who's an associate professor in the Chicana and Chicano Studies Department at UCLA, and her talk will be on Central American women and girls, a gendered view of forced migration. She will be followed by Rachel Lewis, who is assistant professor in women and gender studies at George Mason University. Her talk will be Precarious, Temporality, Neoliberalism, Sexual Citizenship, and the Global Deportation Regime. And then finally, a talk by Dr. Daniel Kanstroom, who is professor of law, and Thomas F. Carney Distinguished Scholar at Boston College of Law. And his talk will be The Forgotten Deported, Towards Better Understanding and a Declaration of Rights. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I really want to thank Kat for inviting me and Jackie and everyone behind the scenes for doing all the work to get us all here. This mic is not staying up. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll just admit that I feel a bit out of my element because normally I don't read and normally I have a PowerPoint, but today I'm going to do the opposite and really take this opportunity to think about something that I have not been doing research on, but something that I have been involved in as an activist and as someone who writes affidavits for asylum claims. So I really look forward to your feedback on this. So last Sunday, I was visiting my mom and my grandmother and great-grandmother, and my mom starts sharing during the conversation that her Facebook friend who lives in our hometown in El Salvador was posting the night before about an ongoing shooting that was happening. Rival gangs were shooting in her neighborhood, and she was hiding under the bed. And this led my mom to go on and kind of reminisce out loud about having been in a very similar situation when I was 4 years old and my little sister was only about 3 days old. And she shared about how she remembered standing up with globs of blood running down her leg as she was still recovering from having given birth just days earlier. Her teeth chattered unstoppably, but she had to pull herself together long enough to make us feel safe. She remembered eating only eggs at the house for days, and when she finally got the courage to go out to El Mercado, the outdoor market, she said only one lady had braved through the fear to be there. She was selling only tomatoes. Walking next to a pile of lifeless bodies on the street, my mother came home with nothing but a bag of tomatoes and the resolve to leave that country as soon as possible. We would be on our way across 3 borders within a couple of months. I didn't grow up hearing these stories. It wasn't until college in a class on Central American politics where I finally learned about this history about U.S. intervention and quashing popular uprisings in the region. And then in the 70s and 80s, the U.S.'s support for the militaries and the elites of each country that set the conditions for the immensely devastating consequences of civil wars. Fearing a communist victory in the region that would stand in the way of U.S. corporations' profits as part of its Cold War operations, the Reagan administration armed and trained the military and paramilitary leaders of death squads with the goal of eliminating all opposition. They indiscriminately scorched entire villages while torturing and disappearing thousands of people. By the end of the 12-year war in El Salvador, at least 75,000 people had been killed. By the end of the 36-year genocidal war in Guatemala, at least 200,000 people had been killed. For the first time in those countries' histories, people started to migrate en masse to the United States in the 1980s. And though they fled clearly documented persecution, they were not recognized as refugees. In the collection that inspired this conference, the new keywords, migration and borders, Nick DeGenova and his colleagues defined the politics of protection as, quote, an attempt to make visible the politics at play in the existing refugee protection regime, end quote. Looking at it from a theoretical perspective, they note that while the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR, they claim to manage refugees from a non-political stance, but in practice, this is impossible whenever nation states are making determinations about who counts as a refugee and who does not. And so they either label people appropriate kinds of refugees or they categorize them instead simply as economic or illegal migrants. In the case of Central Americans, refugee status or asylum would have translated into a much more welcoming and stabilizing entrance, helping increase their chances to thrive in the US, but on the contrary, they were obstructed. Because of the US government's role in the wars, it refused to recognize Central Americans back then as political refugees, and instead, we were all deemed unauthorized migrants. Decades later, this context continues to shape many Central Americans' inability to attain a stable legal status while also officially denying their history by acting as though they had not actually lived through the atrocities that still haunted them. This mattered greatly for me, for my generation, and for younger generations in the US as we grew up not knowing our histories, our parents having been denied validation of their status as survivors and refugees. What I continued to learn beyond college through my own visits there and further research is that back in Central America in the aftermath of the wars, neoliberal policies imposed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, among others, agencies, didn't account for needed investment in education. They only promoted the creation of jobs that pay what people there call sueldos de hambre, or wages that can only result in hunger. Children who had been forcibly recruited to fight in wars still had access to weapons, but were not given opportunities for schooling. So at the same time, back in the US, Central American youth who had settled into poor neighborhoods were met with violence and exclusion while their parents worked multiple jobs or they dealt with their trauma in unhealthy ways. Youth joined gangs seeking belonging and protection. As a result, many were imprisoned, and when the US started to deport gang members in the 1990s to a place where they were not going to be given educational or labor opportunities, they and other poor youth found power and they found survival in gangs. So today, profound poverty, corruption, and a raging US-sponsored war on drugs all continue to fuel the proliferation of gangs that force more people to migrate. In recent years, we've seen a dramatic increase of Central American unaccompanied minors, as well as mothers with children reaching US borders. They most often cite gang violence as their immediate reason for seeking refuge here. So gangs have now become the most common representation of Central Americans in mainstream media portrayals. This is true in documentaries and TV shows that feature one-dimensional Central American characters without sufficient political, economic, or social analysis to contextualize the proliferation of gangs. Viewers then are likely to misunderstand Central Americans as being inherently violent and dangerous. But I want to be very clear that gangs are a legacy of US-funded state terror. They're the result of deep-seated inequalities fed by the kind of massive violence that has generated social trauma in the region for generations. Many Central Americans from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras now living in the U.S. came fleeing those direct consequences of U.S. intervention in those countries. Sociologist Cecilia Menjivar and I have termed the consequences of these policies and contemporary forms of immigration enforcement as legal violence. This legal violence is enacted upon Central American migrants who were denied the opportunity to be categorized and protected as refugees. And the consequences of this denial today are grave. And I want to turn next to the ways that these consequences play out in gendered ways. In 2015, the UNHCR published a report titled Women on the Run about the conditions women are fleeing in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico. Domestic, sexual, and other forms of gendered violence pushed the women, many of them with small children, to embark on a dangerous journey north. The women describe harrowing events of gendered violence that they suffered at the hands of their intimate partners, gang members, and others. These stories are often reminiscent of those recounted by refugees fleeing El Salvador and Guatemala during those countries' civil wars when repressive conditions were set by military and paramilitary groups. So when viewed through this historical lens, current conditions are revealed to be simply a new chapter in gendered forms of violence in Central America and throughout the region. So I want to share with you a few quotes from a 1991 article in the journal Women's Studies International Forum that was written by Adrienne Aaron and her colleagues titled The Gender-Specific Terror of El Salvador and Guatemala, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder in Central American Refugee Women. So the authors first describe the kind of power that military soldiers had in targeting victims. Quote, allegations of guerrilla involvement provided justification for murder should anyone try to hold a soldier accountable for his deeds. But no suspicion need be present for a woman to be targeted if she's not politically involved but is desired as a sexual object by a man. In the military, he may allege a guerrilla involvement, secure that his word will prevail over hers. The authors go on to explain that, quote, women who are sexually abused by men associated with the armed forces cannot call for help, cannot press charges, cannot demand justice, cannot find refuge, for any act of resistance becomes a threat to existence, end quote. So in those cases, women had to risk their lives to escape, basically knowing that social justice, their justice for their own cases would not be achieved there. And if they were lucky enough to make it to the US and tried to file a claim for political asylum, they'd go through a process that often felt like a re-traumatization. The authors say, quote, when a refugee applies for political asylum, the process demands that she retell her painful story and, as in rape trials, offers no guarantee that her testimony will be respected or believed. If she cites sexual assault as evidence of having suffered persecution, the institutionalized character of the crime may go unrecognized, thereby disqualifying the abuse as a claim for political asylum. The refugee is likely to be deported and to face reprisals, often death, in her home country. So much like in that period of civil wars when people understood that no one could stop the military, today's society in the northern region of Central America understands that nobody can stop gangs. Take, for example, an April 29, 2016 article in a Salvadoran newspaper online, elsalvador.com. The journalist described a common trend now to find dead bodies, both men and women, sometimes mutilated, with their hands and feet tied behind their back inside plastic bags or covered in sheets, thrown on the side of the road in burdened areas where they're easy to hide. One of the experts interviewed for the piece states that while men are killed for strictly gang-related business, quote, among the women, it's usually due to infidelity to her partner, generally someone in prison who she hasn't gone to visit in recent months. In some cases, the women have changed partners, and that is what angers the previous partner, end quote. Such descriptions minimize and justify these murders as they explain why there were a record 954 homicides just during the first 40 days of this year, from January 1st to February 10th. And keep in mind that El Salvador is only about 8,000 square miles, roughly twice the size of LA County. Given these circumstances, the UNHCR calls for protection of Central American women seeking asylum outside their countries. And although the US is a signatory to international treaties on refugee rights, the Obama administration has not protected them. In its May 2015 press release, US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, states that, quote, "Our borders are not open to illegal migration, and individuals apprehended crossing the border illegally are a department priority for removal," end quote. By refusing to recognize them as refugees, ICE deems these women and their children as illegal migrants who need not be protected by the 1951 Refugee Convention. In the current chapter, then, of this ongoing history, post 9/11, under the control of Homeland Security, not only are Central Americans being denied refugee status, but they're also labeled as illegal migrants whose migration poses danger to the nation, thereby justifying the government's actions to use them as examples by detaining them indefinitely in an effort to deter future unauthorized migration from the region. This time, the US government is denying Central Americans refugee status to prioritize the profits of a new set of corporations, for-profit prisons. As David Hernandez explains, the current exodus of Central American refugees is being used as an excuse to vastly expand the practice of family detention. In 2014, there was only one detention center in Berks County, Pennsylvania, with 100 beds. Due to the increased numbers of refugees we heard about in our news feeds that summer of 2014, the government added 1,100 beds in, quote, "a temporary public facility in Artesia, New Mexico, and a privately run for-profit facility in Karnes County, Texas." In December 2014, a 480-bed for-profit facility opened in Dilley, Texas, while a larger 2,400-bed facility is being constructed next door. Also in December, the Artesia facility transferred its final detainees, while simultaneously the for-profit Karnes County Residential Center agreed to expand its facility by 626 detention beds, making up for the closure of the New Mexico facility. Altogether, Hernandez tells us, family detention capacity increased 35 times over in fewer than 6 months, end quote. While ICE uses the wrong juridical categories for Central American refugees, it also deceptively uses language to conceal its human warehousing practices. Despite the fact that all detainees refer to detention as prison or jail, when women and children are warehoused together, ICE has euphemistically called these family residential centers. These family residential centers are minimally disguised former prisons that have been sites of suicide attempts by both women and children as detainees get sick from the rotting food and become depressed at being treated like criminals for fleeing violent conditions. As these stories of suffering and victimization are publicized, there has been mounting public pressure in the form of large demonstrations, negative national press coverage, and multiple petitions from a number of organizations, including elected officials. In response to the massive calls to end family detention, ICE has now succeeded in attaining a license in the state of Texas to officially call these instead child care facilities. There have been hundreds of asylum-seeking families at Karnes City Family Detention Center. Among them, there are at least 20 families who, despite passing credible fear interviews, have been denied bond and held in detention for 10 months or longer because they have a prior deportation. ICE has invoked national security concerns to bypass international law, and much of it has been possible precisely because they will not categorize them rightfully as refugees. Indeed, these are refugees fleeing, again, the consequences of U.S. neoliberal and drug war policies. This unwillingness to recognize them as refugees, I argue, has other consequences as well. For the general public not well versed in the basics of migration, refugees are lumped together in a single, unauthorized, dehumanized category. In my experience, this means that even the well-meaning, well-educated observers don't have a framework through which to understand what is happening. They turn to what is now the too often empty rhetoric of comprehensive immigration reform, without the language to recognize the vast ways the U.S. is implicated in people's forced migration, or without the words to understand the forced nature of their displacement. Even sympathetic members of the public want to, quote, integrate these newcomers and envelop them in messages of si se puede that are too simplistic and even problematic for the current circumstances. In LA, in immigrant rights circles, I've witnessed DACA recipients, young adults who formerly called themselves undocumented dreamers, respond with great compassion to the plight of these new young arrivals. Doing what they do very well, they organize quickly to protest hateful responses, they mobilize resources and offer services. In those community and educational spaces, they tried to motivate the young newcomers with their personal stories of triumph, the same stories that had done wonders to inspire a general U.S. public to support dreamers politically. The young Central Americans, however, listened with blank stares. The narrative of meritocratic success seems unattainable, perhaps even quixotic, as they recover from the social trauma and massive violence that marked their escape. Among them, the girls in particular seem unmoved. In the UNHCR report and in countless other journalistic accounts, we hear of unspeakable violence against girls and women in their home countries and as they transit to the US. 6 out of 10, perhaps as many as 8 out of 10 are raped. More recently, we are hearing accounts of sexual abuse in US detention centers as well. The language of si se puede and comprehensive immigration reform doesn't even begin to counteract their trauma. And so even among allies, we don't have the right language or the proper lens to understand how to approach refugees. I want to leave you with a ray of hope, though, because even in the face of such trauma, Central American women have fought back. They fled in previous generations. That's one form of agency, and they do so today when their lives are in danger. Despite facing multiple forms of oppression, even detained women, arguably among the most vulnerable, have managed to organize themselves to draw national and international attention to their plight. In a letter-writing campaign in 2015, they voiced their grievances, telling stories of food that makes them sick, as well as of a lack of health care and lack of basic resources. They denounce that they are treated as less than human, followed around, or put in solitary confinement for speaking out. In October 2015, 27 women began a hunger strike at the T. Don Hutto Detention Center in Taylor, Texas. They, along with detainees in a number of other centers, once again put their bodies on the line, risking their health and their lives to demand humane treatment. Their demand is consistent and clear: release everyone immediately. Importantly, among the people organizing to support them today are many women who have directly or indirectly suffered the consequences of gendered violence of the past. And I want to share with you briefly a list of names of some of the fiercest activists working for justice for contemporary Central American refugee women and children on various fronts. Esther Portillo González, Nancy Zúñiga, Suyapa Portillo, Oriel Siu, Mónica Novoa, Jennifer Cárcamo, Crisia Campos, Lisette Hernández, Cecilia Mengíbar, Morelia Rivas, Alicia Estrada, Esther Hernández, Cristina González. These Central American women have used their knowledge of this region's history along with a consciousness about gender to push these conversations in different spaces, to organize the women in detention, to amplify the voices of refugee mothers who seek justice in their own individual cases, but also more broadly for all women who are fleeing violence. These activists have been able to recognize the humanity of the women because they have not relied on the political vocabulary that is rooted in other struggles and other populations. They've instead centered these women and their status as survivors of gendered violence. I add my name to this list through my work, and I ask that you too move beyond limited and limiting language that currently portrays Central American refugees as merely caricatures of full human beings. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by thanking Kat and the Chicano Latino Research Center for organizing such a wonderful conference. So it's such a pleasure to be here. So as I started to think about keywords in migration studies, I realized that the concept of temporality had been kind of implicitly kind of central to my work for a long time, but I wanted to kind of use this conference as an opportunity to think more about the concept of temporality. And there has been kind of a recent turn towards questions of temporality in migration studies, but what really interests me is that there still isn't a lot of work that's been done on temporality from a kind of intersectional perspective. So thinking about questions of migrant temporality in relation to aspects of gender, race, class, age, ability, and so on. So that was something that I wanted to think about in terms of the research that I do on feminist and queer refugee performance. In November 2012, Ugandan lesbian asylum seeker Jackie Nanyongo was denied political asylum in the United Kingdom on the grounds that she could not provide proof of her homosexuality. Despite the ample evidence provided by Jackie's partner and friends that she was a lesbian, British immigration officials nonetheless proceeded to reject her claim for political asylum. Jackie was subsequently sent to Yarlswood Immigration Detention Center to await deportation to Uganda. On January the 10th, 2013, the day of her scheduled deportation, Jackie struggled for as long as she could against the UK border removal agents, but she was outnumbered. Violently beaten and half-strangled by 4 removal agents, Jackie was overcome by the pain in her chest and was unable to breathe. When Jackie arrived at Entebbe Airport in Uganda, the UK BA removal agents handed her over to the Ugandan immigration authorities, who held her for many more hours without medical attention. Family members were not reunited with Jackie until long after her flight had landed, at which point she was vomiting blood. Jackie's family rushed her to a nearby clinic, but she was unable to get the medical attention she urgently needed. Since Jackie was also in hiding as a lesbian in Uganda, every visit to a doctor or hospital involved a risk not only to her life, but also to the safety of her family. As a result, Jackie's health rapidly deteriorated, and she died 2 months later from the injuries inflicted upon her by the border removal agents during her forced deportation from the United Kingdom. Jackie's tragic death testifies to the often brutal forms of state-sanctioned violence inflicted upon queer refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented populations by the global deportation regime. Despite the newly emerging body of scholarship devoted to theorizing the relationship between citizenship and deportation, however, there's been a lack of attention to the ways in which gender and sexuality, along with race, class, nationality, and geopolitical location, render particular migrants legally vulnerable to deportation. And yet, practices of credibility assessment in the political asylum process are frequently linked to the state's reproduction of neoliberal ideologies of sexual citizenship, ideologies that have a disproportionately negative impact upon refugee women, children, sexual and gender minorities, and individuals with disabilities. In the context of lesbian asylum claims, as I've argued elsewhere, the challenges facing applicants lies not only in proving the gender-specific forms of persecution that women experience, but in the imperative to be openly gay upon arrival in the receiving country. Unlike other refugee claimants, who are not compelled to perform a visible identity in the country to which they migrate, lesbian and gay asylum applicants are expected to conform to neoliberal narratives of sexual citizenship based on visibility, consumption, and an identity in the public sphere. As one Canadian attorney remarks, I used to call it Gay 101. Immigration and Refugee Board members ask claimants what day the Gay Pride Parade was on, where the gay bars in Toronto are located, and whether they are in a relationship. Such sexual citizenship ideologies, according to which rights are defined primarily in relation to consumption, create an impossible burden of proof and a narrative that so few queer female refugees are able to reproduce due to lack of access to appropriate legal representation, detention, and extreme poverty. As we can see in the case of Ugandan lesbian Jackie Nanyongo, while LGBT claims for asylum may not be explicitly prohibited in North America, Europe, or Australia, queer migrants are frequently excluded from accessing such rights through their inability to achieve the status of consumer citizen. While current scholarship on migrant precarity has begun to address the material forms of violence inflicted upon refugees and asylum seekers by the global deportation regime, less attention has been paid to the psychic forms of violence and dispossession that repeated exposure to deportability produces. By deportability, I'm referring to the lived experience of the constant threat of removal, as well as to the ways in which immigration laws and policies render specific migrants legally vulnerable to deportation. And yet, dispossession from a political community often results in an inability to participate in the kinds of social activities that provide a sense of security and comfort in the familiarity and regularity of everyday life. These are less visible, but no less meaningful forms of violence to which refugees and asylum seekers are subjected by the global deportation regime. As Maya Saga has commented, and this is a quote from her, deportability intersects with gender, ethnicity, race, sexuality, and nationality in ways that define subject positions on the labor market, in family life, in relation to the body, and even imaginations of the future. So in this talk, my goal is to recast migrant precarity resulting from deportability as a question of temporality. As I will argue, closer attention to the concept of temporality within feminist and queer migration studies can help us to better account for the multiple and intersecting forms of violence inflicted upon refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented populations by the contemporary global deportation regime. While migration scholars have recently begun to highlight the question of temporality in studies of political asylum and immigration bureaucracy, so I'm thinking here in particular of the work of Melanie Griffiths on rejected asylum seekers in the UK, also Nadia El-Sharari's work on displaced Iraqi refugees in Egypt, and Catherine Brunn's research on refugee displacement in Georgia. So there has been some really interesting work by those scholars on notions of temporality in relation to migration and refugee displacement, but there's been very little attention to how the temporal violences created by political asylum bureaucracies intersect with questions of gender, sexuality, age, or ability. As I'll argue in this talk, however, it is crucial that feminist and queer migration scholars attend to the ways in which the current restructuring of temporal relations under conditions of deportability is linked to the state's reproduction of neoliberal norms of sexual citizenship, norms that are grounded in the idea of both heteronormative reproductive futurism and able normativity. So in the first part of the talk, I'd like to examine how refugee narratives across a variety of media platforms, including photography, painting, and performance art, reflect upon the everyday practices and embodied experiences associated with deportability. As I'll suggest, these refugee performances seek to recast migrant precarity as a question of temporality. So by refugee performance, I'm referring to the points of intersectional slippage between the concept of bureaucratic performance, as in the kind of performative retelling of one's story in the context of the political asylum process, and theatrical performance, as in creative or dramatic forms of performance or entertainment. And I borrow that concept of bureaucratic performance from Alison Jeffers. In the second part of the talk, I'd like to discuss the theoretical and political implications of narratives of temporality in feminist and queer refugee performance in terms of critical theories of citizenship and human rights. In doing so, my goal is twofold. Firstly, I aim to offer a theory of migrant temporality that centers the experiences of women, sexual minorities, and individuals with disabilities. And secondly, by drawing on the insights of scholars working in the fields of feminist and queer disability studies, I seek to provide an intersectional analysis of the neoliberal logics of heteronormative reproductive futurism that underwrite state immigration controls, and by extension, the deportation regime. The above quote from Oreed Asheri's performance project with 12 lesbian asylum seekers entitled Staying, Dream, Bin, Soft Stud, and Other Stories encapsulates how the experience of living with an uncertain future refigures temporality as problematic in the context of displacement. Faced with the unsettling reality of potential deportation, many deportable migrants suffer from the precarity created by living with an uncertain sense of time, one that simultaneously confines them to an endless present, but that can also bring change at any moment. As Nadia El-Sharari has observed in interviews with Iraqi refugees in Egypt, discussions of time in the context of displacement frequently center upon narratives of the past or the future, as migrants are often compelled to live their lives in a present in which they do not want to be. In the collection of photographs, Home Sweet Home, from 2011, produced by rejected female asylum seekers living in the UK, the theme of waiting is presented as central to the experience of what it means to be a refugee. The collection, which is sponsored by the charity Women for Refugee Women, documents the daily struggles for survival faced by female asylum seekers in contemporary Britain. The women featured in the project come from a variety of countries, including Eritrea, Afghanistan, Iran, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Zimbabwe, Somalia, Burundi, Iraq, and Cameroon. As failed asylum seekers, many of the women are destitute, having spent months, and in some cases years, living on the streets while fighting the UK asylum system. Forced to move from place to place, many of the women are homeless with no right to benefits and no right to work. The images in Home Sweet Home thus document the women's basic struggles for survival in a world in which suitcases typically remain unpacked and hot water bottles provide one of the few sources of refuge against the cold. One of the images in the collection is simply titled Waiting, and you can see that image there, and depicts a woman standing in line for a bus, a strategy that many female asylum seekers use to pass the time and to keep out of the cold. As Anne Yeaman, the author of the image, comments, and this is a quote from her, "Asylum seekers spend a lot of time on the buses. If home is bad, they stay on the bus all day and go round and round. Or at night, if they are homeless, they may stay on the bus all night." Unable to move on with their everyday life, migrants are forced into a position where they have little to occupy their time other than to wait. For asylum seekers, like Anne Yeaman, life itself becomes shaped by the experience of waiting, by a slowing down or stillness of time. Numerous studies on the mental health of refugees have shown how the restructuring of temporal relations for those navigating the political asylum process contributes to emotional suffering and to a lack of mental well-being. As Madeleine, one of the women involved in the Home Sweet Home project, comments, "My mind is all over the place. I am not at peace. I want to work to help myself, but time is passing." The experience of being made to wait, as Melanie Griffiths has noted, is bound up in normative power relations and is typically associated with forms of bureaucratic domination. As she suggests, the imposition of waiting for asylum, always with the promise of eventual change, is part of the technique of state immigration control that sustain the marginality of migrants through placing them in a position of directionless stasis. As one of the women in the Home Sweet Home comments regarding the incapacitating and infantilizing effects of the asylum process on her sense of mental well-being. "Being destitute affects your mind, body, and soul. I found that when I was destitute, I couldn't plan my life. You feel useless and down, you're not steady, you become like a child." In this way, we can see how state immigration policies, while ostensibly valorizing neoliberal ideals of personal responsibility and social entrepreneurship, actually produce gendered and racialized states of refugee dependency that transform asylum seekers into diminished and impoverished subjects in a way that creates serious obstacles to their credibility when they seek political asylum. The extent to which the asylum process produces debilitating and disabling conditions for refugees that seek to strip them of their political agency by reducing them to conditions of childlike dependency is strikingly evident in the artwork The Bristol Disability Murals, painted by a group of disabled refugees and asylum seekers in Britain. In the mural, the asylum seekers reflect upon the relationship between the experience of having physical or mental disabilities and the kinds of disabling conditions that affect all refugees forced to navigate the asylum process. In one image, which you can see actually at the far right, just below where the sun is shining, the two people sitting at the table drinking coffee. So that image, in this image, a disabled asylum seeker, he speaks of the reality of living in a timeless present as the world and the people around him continue forward with their everyday lives, oblivious to the pain of those around them. Indeed, many of the asylum seekers who participated in the mural speak of the sense of endless suspended time created by the political asylum bureaucracy as a source of oppression, one that makes their lives unproductive and prevents them from achieving their desired social goals and personal progress. Specifically, they comment upon how the asylum process excludes them from the pleasures and vicissitudes of social aging because of its attempt to prevent them from exercising adult-like self-determination. In one particularly powerful image from the murals, a woman depicts how she would rather commit suicide than be deported to her home country, a testimony to how the temporal violences created by conditions of deportability a link to emotional suffering and psychological trauma. So the image there at the top is of the woman jumping from the window of her room as the police van comes to deport her. In Orit Asheri's Staying, another online publication based on an interactive performance project with 12 lesbian asylum seekers that took place in 2009, state violence against refugees and asylum seekers is similarly related to their deportable status. Staying, which alludes to the legal process known as a stay of deportation, calls attention to the constant sense of uncertainty experienced by lesbian refugees and asylum seekers, many of whom are forced to negotiate multiple court cases, rejections, legal appeals, detention, possible deportation, and poverty. Many of the alter ego performances in Staying revolve around the women's everyday encounters with the deportation regime, the experience of arrest, and the memory of past or attempted deportation. As a conceptual practice, Staying not only invokes resistance, as in the notion of staying put, but also implies the possibility of hesitation and delay. In the context of the workshops, Staying thus articulates the agency of lesbian asylum seekers at the same time that it seeks to convey the multiple forms of violence inflicted upon lesbian migrants by the constant threat of deportation. In the first chapter of Staying, the character Tree Man, who you see kind of depicted there, recalls her shock at the suddenness of her attempted forced removal from the United Kingdom. And this is her narrative. Once I was put in detention for 2 months, and suddenly, out of the blue, I was escorted from the center to the airport, and it was 5 minutes before the plane was to leave. So I shouted at everybody, "I don't want to be deported." There were 4 officers holding me, 2 on each side. They were consoling me, telling me to keep my voice down and to stay calm. I said, "No, I don't want to go. Get me out of here." My girlfriend called and told me on the phone, "Shout, shout, don't let them take you." So I shouted. I've never screamed so loud in my life, and they had to take me off the plane. In Treeman's narrative, deportation, or the threat of deportation, produces a particularly acute form of temporal rupture, one that dramatically alters her sense of both the present and the future. As Treeman later notes, the ability to continuously resist such practices of state violence can take a profound psychological and emotional toll upon queer refugees. She writes, "Just before that, my deportation, I've been thinking, okay, they can do what they want with me. I'm tired of my life. If they want to take me away, they can. If they want to kill me, they can kill me. I give up. I was really so down. I was ready to go. I'd given up on my life." Treeman's recollections of her attempted forced removal from the UK acknowledge the profound emotional and psychological effects of deportability upon refugees and asylum seekers. Confined to living in the present, those faced with a constant threat of removal are unable to plan for more than a few days ahead. As Melanie Griffiths notes, a significant source of the instability caused by the asylum and detention systems is the tension between anticipating constant change, as in sudden deportation, and the fear of indefinite stasis. Indeed, Treeman's narrative illustrates how the constant threat of deportation produces feelings of hopelessness and despair. As Lois McNay has written, and this is a quote from her, "The emotion of hope is crucially linked to a particular social position, most especially to the agent's objective ability to manipulate the potentialities of the present in order to realize some future project." One's ability to experience hope, in other words, is contingent upon one's ability to imagine alternatives to the present. Deportability, however, produces migrant illegality, as Nicholas de reminds us, not merely as an anomalous juridical status, but as, and I borrow his term here, as an enforced orientation to the present, one which, by definition, withholds all promises of the future. In this way, the condition of deportability leaves migrants unable to make long-term plans, and in some cases, unable to imagine any kind of viable future at all. By showing how the contemporary global deportation regime enacts temporal violence through condemning migrants to a state of precarious temporality, feminist and queer refugee performance calls attention to the political asylum system as a site of legalized violence by which women, sexual minorities, and individuals with disabilities are differentially deprived of the resources needed to make credible asylum claims. In the context of the political asylum process, The precariousness of women, sexual minorities, and individuals with disabilities constitutes a socially assigned disposability that is produced as an effect of state-sanctioned forms of racism, heteronormativity, ableism, and xenophobia. Moreover, as these performances indicate, the kind of dispossession asylum seekers experience as a result of political asylum policies not only encompasses literal forms of state violence such as detention and deportation. Rather, these asylum narratives also show how the mental torture inflicted upon refugee women, sexual minorities, and individuals with disabilities produces emotional debility, or what Anne Chetkovich calls sovereignty of an emotional kind, as a specific form of vulnerability that targets migrants for premature death by depriving them of the ability to imagine the future. And don't worry, this is a very short section. In her landmark essay, The Origins of the Nation-State and the End of the Rights of Man, Hannah Arendt provocatively articulates the question of refugee vulnerability in terms of the paradoxes of rights. As Arendt persuasively argues, human rights only become meaningful within the context of citizenship rights. For Arendt, it is not that the stateless and the dispossessed are unequal before the law, but rather that no law exists for them. For this reason, she argues, the refugee can only become intelligible as a subject by way of criminalization. While Arendt's critique of rights has been widely used by scholars working on both international migration and human rights to account for the contemporary criminalization of refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented populations, what has not been taken up in the existing scholarship on migration to date is Arendt's theorization of refugee time. As Arendt discusses in The Human Condition, dispossession from a political community not only results in the removal of one's citizenship rights, and thus by extension one's human rights, but it also culminates in the inability to participate in the kinds of social activities that instill a sense of comfort and security in the familiarity of everyday life. In her essay, We Refugees, Arendt explains how refugees' loss of home entails the loss of the familiarity of daily life and the rupture of their private lives. As she notes, refugees are often compelled to live under conditions that make it difficult for them to engage in the repetitive forms of work, labor, and creative action that bestow a sense of trust in the regularity of everyday life. For Arendt, however, it is precisely these repetitive, cyclical activities that provide human beings with a sense of vitality and liveliness. She argues that it's primarily by engaging in these forms of creative labor that human beings enjoy the sheer bliss of being alive. She suggests that when this cycle of painful exhaustion and pleasurable regeneration is thrown out of balance, we lose the elemental happiness that comes from being alive. Without these creative forms of labor, human beings lose trust in the reality and meaningfulness of everyday life. Arendt's conceptualization of the linkages between work, labor, and creative action helps to account for some of the less visible forms of violence and dispossession inflicted upon refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented populations within the contemporary global economic order. As Ruth Russell and Frances Stage have commented regarding the experiences of Sudanese women in refugee camps, in the absence of quotidian activities that constitute the basis of everyday life, coupled with a lack of opportunities to share their stories and be believed, refugees often find themselves trapped in what they call long periods of unstructured time, or the stillness of an endless present. Part of what constitutes this sense of an enforced orientation to the present, according to Arendt, is the ways in which refugees' position outside the law has the effect of producing everyday life as a burden, rather than as an opportunity for self-fulfillment and creative action. For Arendt, the right to freedom of movement is contingent upon the possibility of creative action, or what Nicholas de Geneva has referred to as, quote, or capacity to creatively transform or objective circumstances. What is crucial, I argue, about the feminist and queer refugee performances discussed here is that they redefine the concept of refugee labor to account for some of the less visible forms of precarity and dispossession resulting from the experience of being a contingent or deportable subject. By enacting forms of cultural labor that seek to counteract the state-sanctioned modes of violence that attempt to reduce migrants to inhabiting the realm of precarious temporality, these refugee performances powerfully attest to the ways in which deportable subjects can imagine themselves to be otherwise, creatively, artistically, and narratively. Through enabling migrants to take control of their own time, to transform spaces of suspended time into spaces of creativity, Feminist and queer refugee performance, by its very existence, constitutes a solution to the problems of reproductive futurism and ableism that it portrays. Rather than being condemned to live in the realm of what feminist and queer disability scholars have referred to as prognosis time, where the concept of futurity itself becomes precarious, refugees can use art and performance as a vehicle for critiquing the neoliberal state's normative investment in the idea of a compulsory future. Instead, these refugee performances encourage us to imagine a different kind of futurity, one that, rather than seeking to eradicate differences, invites us to invest in public cultures that are capable of welcoming or particular vulnerabilities to come. And then just very briefly, as I've argued here, efforts to assist refugees and asylum seekers must acknowledge the question of temporal violence, or the ways in which immigration asylum policies attempt to reduce migrants to a state of precarious temporality. By showing how political asylum policies are structured in a way that renders women, sexual minorities, and individuals with disabilities as disposable populations, refugee art and performance points towards the need for coalitions between feminist, queer, immigrant, disability, and anti-racist advocates. Such activism reveals the urgency of tackling the state's reproduction of neoliberal norms of citizenship via the global deportation regime from an intersectional perspective. In doing so, participatory art and performance with refugees and asylum seekers demonstrates the limits of current Marxist approaches to immigrant deportability, approaches that not only marginalize questions of gender, sexuality, and ability in refugee experience, but that fail to account for the ambivalent nature of migrant labor and creative action as that which is both vulnerable to exploitation and that which is in need of preservation. In this way, not only do feminist and queer refugee performances recast migrant precarity as a question of temporality, but they constitute a form of creative resistance in their own right. Thank you so much.
Do I make this happen, or does it happen? That's the end. We need to go to the beginning. Well, greetings from Boston, 3,000 miles that way. It's approximately 3 a.m. Tuesday, my time. I'm just filling time until we get to the beginning of the PowerPoint. I want to join the chorus of people. By the way, my time doesn't start now. I'm going to join the chorus of thanks to Catherine Ramirez. Oh, that's the beginning, okay. And to Jackie, and it's an honor to be on this panel with such poignant presentations. I thought I'd begin by giving some advice. I know there's a lot of students here, and my advice is that someday, if you stay in school and you look both ways before crossing and you use sunscreen and you stay out of trouble, you might get an academic job and you might be invited to speak at a great conference like this. And this is a wonderful opportunity because you'll meet smart people and you'll hear interesting things. However, you may be selected for the last slot on Friday afternoon before the wine and the food is available. And my advice to you is resist that if you possibly can, for reasons that will become apparent as I go forward. I thought I would begin just by framing who I am a little bit. I'm, I think, the only lawyer and the only law professor on this panel, and I should say that I come to this subject from a background of actually representing many, many asylum seekers starting in the 1980s, and representing many people facing deportation over many years in a variety of contexts, and then trying to understand the nature of this beast of a deportation system. And so what I want to talk about today is how I've come to understand that system and some new initiatives that we've been developing at Boston College, and actually more broadly than that, in order to conceptualize and to fight some of the tendencies of deportation. And after that, in deference to the last panel, I want to tell you a funny story about me and Donald Trump and John Lennon and the Beatles that, I'm just kidding, I just want to see if you're paying attention. So One could begin by asking the question, what is deportation? And of course, there's a very simple way to begin this, and we have many simple and functional definitions of it. The expulsion of non-citizens by a state through the threatened or actual use of force or the removal of a non-citizen. That's the basic of it. I have some YouTube clips, but actually I'm going to skip them, so don't show these because in the interest of time, I just think we won't. And I think that for many people here, you understand that description is completely inadequate to express the brutality and the nature of what real deportations look like. And one thing that I want to talk about is also that this is a phenomenon that actually sort of came of age in the United States starting in about the late 1980s, although I've written a book that actually traces it back to colonial times in some forms, depending on how you define it. But its maturation process is a late 20th century phenomenon in the United States, but it is now increasingly a global phenomenon, again, as previous speakers have discussed, and I'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward. Because of my understanding of deportation as being something more than that simple, sterile definition, I want to begin with 4 somewhat polemical assertions that will help frame for you what it is that I'm going to suggest in general about deportation. The first is this: that global and U.S. deportation systems are major, harsh enforcement mechanisms, and they implicate much more than immigration status. So many people think that deportation is primarily or exclusively about immigration. I want to suggest that it's much more than that, and that these are best understood as enforcement systems. Second thing is that, and again, as previous panelists have discussed, deportation systems are invariably legally anomalous, by which I mean they occupy a very interesting and complex area between civil and criminal law, as was discussed in the last panel, but also between human rights law and state action, between state sovereignty and individual rights. There are many things we could talk about, but for now, let me just say that they are legally anomalous and much larger than most people think. And I bet they're much larger than even many of the very well-educated people in this room think, and I'll give you some statistics that are a little different from some of the other statistics you've probably seen about this. Second, of course, the racial and ethnic composition of their targets is especially significant, and this goes to the something more than it is about than immigration. And finally, of course, that they challenge powerful societal values and basic human rights. And as I've argued in a book that I published 3 years ago, the U.S. system has created this new American diaspora of U.S. deportees, people who are born and raised in this country, who typically speak only English or English as their first language, who are now, you can find them in the Azores, you can find them in the Dominican Republic, you can find them in Haiti, you can find them all over the world. So it's a particularly interesting phenomenon because of its size and also its focus in the late Bush and Obama administrations, increasingly on people who were raised in the United States, long-term lawful permanent residents. That's another phenomenon that I want to talk about as we go forward. So the first step of my basic theoretical argument is that deportation represents an apparent encounter between sovereign border control, where state power is at its zenith, and basic rights claims between people. And actually tell my students this is part of what has always made it so challenging and interesting for me, because deportation represents this poignant moment of an encounter between the nation state at its absolute height of power, that is sovereign control of the borders, and the individual who is actually at the weakest ebb of an individual rights claim, the person without status or with tenuous status. And that makes it a very interesting moment for a person like me who actually also specializes in human rights theory. I mean, this is the moment where human rights, if they have any bite, if the idea of rights have any bite, this is the place where you would need them the most. And of course, Hannah Arendt recognized this long before I did, although we may differ, she and I, about, well, she's dead, so I'm going to win that argument at the moment, but we may differ theoretically about the relationship between rights and citizenship, but let's discuss that in questions. So this does demand serious critical inquiry, and if you can't name these people, I can't help you right now, but I think there are a number of different framings that one could use to approach this, and I just will tell you that I have thought about this before, but I can't tell you exactly the relationship to Rawls and Habermas right now. Deportation and expulsion should be understood, and here's a key point, and I don't think anybody has made this point yet, so this is an assertion that I will try to defend going forward. It is a distinct political, legal phenomenon and a system. It has its own history, its own dynamics, its own anomalies, its own harsh effects, and in particular, its own metastatic tendencies, which is actually what is happening, I think, a lot in Europe now, between actual connections between people from the Department of Homeland Security using lessons that have been learned in the US context that are increasingly being picked up by people in a European agency called Frontex, and we're seeing some of these models being exported. It's actually not that new of a phenomenon, but it's getting larger, and it has deep legitimacy problems. It needs to be critiqued and restrained. Now, I think as we try to understand it in the United States, we also have to understand that another thing that makes it interesting and complex is that it has actually always been a part of the American dilemma. This is a statement from George Washington to a group of Irish immigrants in 1783, in which he begins by expressing the classic American ideal of asylum and the country being open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions whom we shall welcome. That's what Washington said at first. In fact, that phrase, whom we shall welcome, was the title of a presidential report on immigration in 1951, I believe. But then he said, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment. There has always been this tension between the ideal of openness and this judging function, this sieve function. And it takes place not only at the first encounter at the border, but deportation is a mechanism that implements some of that dilemma. And this became quite poignant and important during the Alien and Sedition Act period of 1798. And there are two basic approaches to it. I tend to side with Madison on this, who wrote, even if aliens are not parties to the Constitution, it does not follow that the Constitution has vested in Congress an absolute power over them. What does that mean? It's a basic statement of fundamental human rights. And part of what I'm going to suggest to you going forward is that remains, I think, the best way to think about this for various reasons, even though it is not as enforceable as one might like. Jefferson had a different theory, which is a little more famous in its language. These are the critiques of the president's Alien and Sedition Acts in the 1790s, which, by the way, authorized the Adams administration to just designate people randomly with no process at all and order them to be deported from the United States. A law that made one of his enforcers so enthusiastic that he actually came to the president with blank warrants and said, just sign them and I'll figure out who ought to go. These were French people, which you may not have much sympathy for anyway, but that in any case, it was challenged. Jefferson said, the key is that the friendless alien has been selected as the safest subject of a first experiment, but the citizen will soon follow. So this is an argument about the metastatic tendencies of deportation, about if you let it happen to them, it will next happen to us. I think this is an inadequate theory because it actually recapitulates the same distinction between the alien and the citizen, or the non-citizen and the citizen for rights purposes. So this nation of immigrants mythology in the United States, I think, should not be taken lightly. I think that this idea of being a nation of immigrants, the first part of Washington's statement, is something that needs to be cherished and reaffirmed because of the values that it implicitly embodies. And these are values, of course, of diversity and pluralism and an open society, a certain conception of dynamism and human rights. And I think this becomes clear, and I actually for many years used Germany as the classic example of the nation state that has an alternative vision, that is to say basically an ethno-cultural conception of the legitimate polity and of the nation state. Ironically enough, Germany has, as I'm sure you all know, has emerged recently as a more protective regime for refugees from the Middle East than the United States in some ways. But still, I think when we're trying to assess the nature of deportation, we need to pay homage to this nation of immigrants mythology, even though deportation contradicts it in many ways. And this leads to a set of questions about how might we theorize deportation and rights. And I don't have time to go into these other than to sort of tick them off, although I do want to focus on two heuristics that haven't been discussed previously today. Of course, deportation functions as border control, that's obvious. It functions as a sort of demography control, that's also obvious. It functions as labor market regulation, that's a little less obvious, but other speakers have mentioned it, that it is a form, obviously, of controlling various aspects of the labor market. When you listen to people like Donald Trump, or Ted Cruz for that matter, talk about it, you get these ideas of crime control, and most painfully for me, this very binary sort of rigid idea of the rule of law. You know, that's the idea. What part of illegal do you not understand? They broke the law, period. That's what somebody said. I don't remember exactly who it was. And I wrote something in response to that saying that actually the phrase that any sophisticated lawyer would give is, they broke the law, question mark. You know, you can't say they broke the law, period. You just say somebody broke the law, then it's a question mark. So what do you want to do about it? So what are the demands of proportionality? How do we, as a sophisticated legal system, handle a breaking of the law? How do we understand it? In any case, I think in order to understand deportation, it's also useful to disaggregate two of its forms. In one form I refer to as extended border control. This is the idea that applies to people, and it actually derives from your basic idea about the nation state. If you believe in the nation state, you probably believe in the fundamental legitimacy of borders. I'm not saying that any or many people here believe that, but if one does, then one can accept the proposition that if one crosses the border without the authority of the nation state, deportation is an understandable mechanism for a government to use to correct that violation of the law. Again, I'm not endorsing this, but I'm suggesting that the legitimacy theory of this form of deportation is very tied to whatever it is that you happen to think about the nation state. And it's actually very hard to criticize this sort of deportation without getting into a sort of cosmopolitan theory that transcends your idea of the nation state. Now, that's not to say that you might not want to put in, as I do, for example, a statute of limitations or a regime of refugee law, protections for people who are fleeing harm. All of those things are consistent with this, but those are discretionary corrective mechanisms. The second form of deportation, which I call post-entry social control, is to my mind much more problematic, and this has been a rising trend in the United States for about the last 15 or 20 years. That's the form that applies to people who are otherwise in legal status, but who run afoul of some aspect of the criminal law, and often it can be a very minor aspect of the criminal law, or some aspect of political law or ideology, and this is the historical mechanism that was used against communists and various dissidents and labor organizers and so on and so on. The legitimacy argument in favor of that form of deportation, I have to say, is kind of mysterious to me, and therefore I tend to argue that it is basically illegitimate in most of its forms. But I think it is interesting to separate out those two things. So I've also begun to think, and I won't belabor this now, to think about how could we understand the special harm that is caused by deportation. You know, in law, there's a historical line of cases that said death is different. You know, the death penalty was different. And I've just been writing some things about saying deportation is different because of its irreversibility, because of its absolute quality, its disproportionality, its difference from other types of sanctions. One might also analogize it to eviction, that there is something particularly poignant and painful about taking away something that a person has had. I mean, it's bad to exclude people who are fleeing harm, but it may be worse to actually give people the opportunity to be here for a while and then take away their family. You know, so eviction is kind of like that. Anyway, there are a lot of different ways that one can think about it. Let me move on to how it actually works. First of all, as I suspect you know, but I always find that it's worth reiterating it, deportation applies to anybody who is not a U.S. citizen. So that is not only the undocumented, of course, but asylum seekers, people in various liminal statuses and complex statuses. And of course, you could have a green card in this country for 50 years. You could have a dozen children. You could have won the Nobel Peace Prize. If you get caught with cocaine, for example, you will be deported for that. So long-term green card holders are subject to deportation just like the undocumented, although, again, as I said, the forms are different. How big is the deportation system? Now, this is an interesting question, and there are different ways to measure it, but based on my experience as a lawyer and my sense that people who are undocumented or even people who have some involvement with the criminal justice system who aren't citizens often find that deportation is the most important aspect of the rule of law with which they concern themselves. It's the thing that they fear most, they think most about it. So if we measure the size of the deportation against the population over whom it hangs, we come up with numbers like this. Tens of millions of people are subject potentially to many tens of millions of people, actually. Hundreds of millions of people, if you count it in a more dynamic sense, of workers and students and tourists and people who come into this country. So that's one way to measure the system. Of course, the other more conventional way is to measure the number of incidents that happen. And of course, here we have the Obama administration, and this is sort of the conventional numbers of about 400,000 per year. But I'm going to give you some bigger numbers as I go forward with this. And there are bigger numbers. The basic argument, though, just to put an asterisk or to underline it, is that we are living in the middle of a radical, unprecedented social experiment with massive, harsh deportation enforcement. I think it's important to just say this because in a way we've gotten used to it, but I remember a time, even in my lifetime as an adult, where deportation was actually a quite small system by comparison to what we have now. And I think it's worth maintaining some sense of shock and alarm about the experiment in which this country has been engaged, even though our political leadership don't want to think about it that way, including obviously President Obama. There has never been a system like this before in the history of the world. And I think that's important to say, and it's had dreadful consequences. So here's another way to measure it. What if we count the number of times that an individual has encountered U.S. government agents on U.S. soil and been ordered to leave? This leads to a number of 25 million events over 25 years. Now, again, this is a different way to count the statistics, but I think it gives some impetus to the point that I was making before about most people not understanding how large this system is. And I think in some ways this is a better way to measure it. So I'm going to skip over this. I just got a sign that said something like I have 40 minutes only to go, so I should start wrapping it up. Okay. Of course, budgets are also an important phenomenon. The government is spending about $18 billion. We've spent close to $200 billion on deportation since this turn in the late 1980s. And of course, as I said, it's being exported to Europe. Frontex is a very interesting subject for research. I don't know if anybody is doing it. I'd love to hear from people who are. It's the European Border Agency that is overseeing the deportations from Europe. And it's creating a sort of new form of dynamic sovereignty by transcending individual nation states and coordinating deportations throughout Europe. But let me just scroll quickly. Basic part of the argument, number 4, is that the best way to restrain this and to think about it, and I told you I'm coming at this as a lawyer and as a law professor, is to use the understandings of international human rights law, and that's what I've been trying to do. So I'm going to skip over this stuff. Apologies. I have a longer version of this. Anybody who wants to come and join me for a semester at Boston College, I can give you the full version of this. But I want to get to the project that was the main form of what I was going to talk about today. Actually, let me also point out some of the anomalous aspects of this, and they were hinted at before, but just so you understand what we're grappling with here. Deportation embodies mandatory detention that is different from all but the most severe forms of criminal law. So if you're placed in deportation proceedings, you can be held without bail for as long as the proceedings take. You have no right to counsel. If you face deportation and you can't afford a lawyer, you won't get one. And there's good statistical research about the incredible difference that a good lawyer can make in removal proceedings. Deportation is retroactive, as somebody mentioned before. That is to say, you can be deported for something that was not a deportable offense when you did it. And that's because of the civil criminal distinction that was put in place in the late 19th century. So that's what I meant by anomalous. And of course, the harshness of it has been well documented in terms of family separation, the removal of parents from children, and so forth. So for this reason, a few years ago, I started a project that was called the Ruby Slippers Project, to work with people after they had been deported, because what began to frustrate me more and more was the difficulty of fighting deportation cases and the fact that the government used the border as a sort of black hole of human rights, that once a person was out, the argument was, well, they have no rights anymore. anymore. Now they're treated as if they're just another alien trying to get back in. That was the government theory on it. So we developed a project to work with these people, to conceptualize this as a new area of law that transcended the boundaries of the nation state and could help people. And we've actually brought a number of people back. I want to tell you something about the name. We called it, because it's a cautionary tale about human rights branding and activism. I called it the Ruby Slippers Project, just as a straw poll. How many people get that reference in this room? About half. So this is already a bad sign. So it's from The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy has the ruby slipper. She clicks her heels. I thought it was a great idea. There's no place like home. You know, you get it. And we even found that there was a Judy Garland museum, actually, that can sell you ruby slippers. We had mugs and ruby slippers. Then we went up to the Cambodian community in Lowell, Massachusetts, and somebody translated Ruby Slippers Project into Khmer as the Red Shoes Project. And they immediately thought we were communists and nobody wanted to talk with us. So that's why it's now called the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project. Less cinematic, but more accurate. The main project we've been working on is largely because of this phenomenon, that we think there are thousands, probably tens of thousands of people who actually have been wrongly deported from the United States for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's just a forensic mistake. Wrong criminal record, lawyer fell asleep, whatever. Other times, it's because the government aggressively pushed theories of deportation for a long time that were later found by the Supreme Court to have been incorrect. We get emails in our project every day from Honduras. We're working on a case now of a guy who's in Chile who was deported for possession of a small amount of ecstasy. He should not have been deported, according to the Supreme Court. So this is part of the legal idea of bringing these people back. The fundamental question at the root of this is, are human rights enforceable, or are they a fairy tale? For those who don't get this reference, that's a fairy, and it's the only one I could come up with on short notice for a PowerPoint. But what we're trying to do now is to develop a declaration on the rights of deported people. To come to, and we've had 3 organizing conferences for this already, including main top famous political theorists and activists, people running potato farms with deportees in Jamaica, Cambodians, Guatemalans. We've done a lot of work in Guatemala, actually, which I can talk more about as we go forward, to try to get an understanding analogous to refugees, that the deportation system has concretized enough and has become large enough and global enough that there's a commonality among the people who are its victims and its targets around the world, and that a rights document makes sense for these people. So you can find this document on our website, which is the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project. And the key is this rights framing, this idea of cognizability, that these people have cognizable rights claims, and also to develop a certain solidarity among people. And I hope that it can serve as an organizing tool and a way of giving voice to the people around the world. And again, I think this is going to be an increasing phenomenon. So I don't have time to get into all the provisions of it, other than to say that it focuses on the dignity of the individual, the security of the individual during the deportation process, the right to maintain things like continuity of health care, the right to maintain earned Social Security benefits, the right to stay in contact with children and parents, vice versa, even the idea that the nation state has an obligation to facilitate visits for those kind of purposes. So there's a lot in there, and if you're at all interested in it, I would urge you to take a look at it. There's all sorts of provisions, and we're trying to get signatories. We're going to be aggressively promulgating this. So if you go to the Post-Deportation Project website, you can see it, and you can join us in this. I want to end with the last, there is a little YouTube clip, which is from a boy in the Postville raid who was interviewed. And I just love this little clip because it's so poignant. It's a boy who faced deportation. Postville, by the way, was the place, apropos of the previous panel, where this aggravated identity theft theory was begun. It's interesting to watch his career choice options and how he moved from one thing to another. Can you just play that, and then I'll end with one last thought. See if this works. I'd be astounded if this works.
Okay, dime cómo te sientes. How are you feeling?
Well, I feel that this is kind of injustice, because when I turned on the TV the second day, they were voicing their opinions, and some guy said that they were criminals and that they should be taken away. And another woman said that it was their fault bringing their children in here, knowing that was one of their fates. So then I was thinking that we're not criminals. my mom and dad came here so I could get an education. And now, my dad said he wanted me to be a veterinarian. Now I want to be a lawyer. And I want to help people who have the same fate as me, because now I know how it feels.
I think it's quite moving, obviously, but I also thought the particular transition from veterinarian to human rights lawyer has a lot of resonance to it. Let me just end with a last thought, which is that a lot of people, I think that I and others who do this work do it as a sort of charity work or pro bono work. But the main takeaway for me is that this deportation system, even beyond the human consequences, has torn apart the fabric of constitutional democracy and the best understanding of the rule of law in this country. So this is not something that we do for them, that citizens do for non-citizens, that Americans do for others. It's a matter of sort of reweaving this fabric, and human rights law and principles give us the tools to reweave that fabric and to bring human dignity and protection of families back into that equation. Thank you very much.
So we've had an amazing set of presentations, and I would like to open it up to questions and comments. Okay, well.
I see.
Okay.
So I have a question for the last presentation in your list of human rights that you'd want to see enforced or established for the people who have been deported. I noticed one was, like you said, family visits, and I'm wondering how much that accepts the action of tearing apart the family in the first place, and why it wouldn't be considered a human right to not be torn apart. And so by institutionalizing the right to have a family visit, at the same time institutionalizes the right to tear apart the family. So I'm just wondering about the logic behind that.
Thank you. So that's, of course, the key question that has come up at every one of our drafting conferences about this. Are we now creating deportation with a human face? Are we just putting accepting a phenomenon that we should reject entirely? And my preference would be to reject the phenomenon entirely, particularly in its disproportionate manifestations or when it separates families. What I didn't get a chance to say is I think the key element in human rights law that we don't have in this country is a mandatory proportionality balancing test. I'm not a deportation abolitionist. I'm not a cosmopolitan in that sense. So in intellectual honesty, I have to say that I do essentially accept the nation state, and that creates certain dilemmas for me. But my preference would be to not do these deportations at all. I think it's a fundamentally unjust regime. But this is the reality that we face. So if we can build in some protections for human rights, assuming we can't win the battle in the first instance, it's a secondary protection mechanism to say at the very least the nation state, the deporting nation state has an obligation to pay attention to these things. But it's obviously not the first call. And in Europe, there's been an interesting evolution, by the way, between norms that protected families to now protecting individuals who are sufficiently connected and have their lives here. There have been various theories to protect that. So I think the trend in human rights law is to protect most long-term residents, whether documented or undocumented, from deportation, absent, a very serious crime or something that they've done that is really terrible. But what we're trying to deal with is the reality of the fact that I think abolishing deportation is not going to happen anytime soon. And in the meantime, these deportees, as my title indicated, are a forgotten group of people whose rights are not being attended to. So it's kind of a triage in some ways. That's probably the best way to think about it. Although that's true as to the one thing that you focused on, but I think there are other aspects of this that are maybe less triage-y and more just accepting the reality that some deportations are going to take place. But how about not deporting a person with drug-resistant tuberculosis, for example, which you would think would be an easy one, but is not. I mean, I began this because I had a client who went blind in immigration detention and was dumped in the airport in Panama City by, the U.S. government with no contact. Nobody knew how to pick him up. His family didn't know he was there. It's just, that was it. That was the end of the story.
I just spent some time in Germany, and I witnessed many thousands of people arriving and then being told they had to wait for about 8 months to a year, depending on how long it took the government to establish their asylum status. And during that time, they couldn't leave, they couldn't get a job, and they just had to stay with a bit of funding from the government and also vocational school for learning the German language. But I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts on that was, and also if you agree with those measures, and if not, what would you do differently?
Do you want to speak to that? I mean, I can speak to it, but I don't want, okay.
Yeah, I'll go after you.
No, why don't you go ahead?
No, you go ahead first.
This has been a fascinating moment for Germany. And I really have to say that I do give Angela Merkel a lot of credit for sort of being open in ways, even though she actually doesn't do it, as far as I can tell, out of an actual empathy with refugees or a real understanding of them as people. It's sort of almost as a sense of duty and the management priorities of a nation state and its laws. You know, there's a sort of ganz praktisch, if you speak German, element to it. You know, this is just what we do. And it really is going to be an interesting question, because I think what many people do not understand is that letting in 1 million people is not the same thing as granting asylum to 1 million people. And so the German system is going to have to figure out how are those claims going to be adjudicated. And it's not simple, because a lot of these people, if you take a strict interpretation of refugee and asylum law, don't qualify and probably won't be able to make out the case of individualized persecution that you have to make in order to gain asylum status. I should say, though, that I was just at a panel at Columbia University where there were some people who are really deep into the knuckles of this at high levels, who tell me that their best guess is that the German adjudicators are going to use relatively liberal, more like UNHCR interpretations of these cases, and that they think it's unlikely that Germany is going to deport large numbers of people. But I don't know. I mean, I should say, I remember I did research in Germany in the 90s and interviewed a German official in the Interior Ministry when there was a previous asylum crisis. And I was asking him about this, and he said something to me that was, I thought, the biggest understatement I had ever heard anybody say. He said, you must understand that the tolerance of the German people is not unlimited. And I think, yeah, well, history does kind of say that.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that you just said. I mean, just to add to that, I think that because the asylum bureaucracy, it often takes so long for the cases to be processed that many of the refugees who are in Germany, now I know, for example, that in Berlin, there are a lot of refugees are homeless, families destitute, living on the streets, and for who knows how long, and especially given the kind of deportation may be unlikely, but asylum or refugee status may also be unlikely. So it's kind of a complicated situation. Like, on the one hand, Germany has allowed many migrants to enter, but there aren't really the provisions in place to kind of help them kind of move on with their lives. So it's a complicated situation, but I don't know the specific details about Germany.
Oh, but just since you asked what we think about it, let me just say, I mean, it's obviously horrible and deplorable, and yet there are 40 million people or more living in refugee camps around the world who fear going back as well. So it's a big systemic problem, and this was a particular crisis and emergency, and of course these people need safe protection and safe havens, and I'm not confident that Turkey is going to protect their rights at all, or Greece, and yet we can go around the world and find other similar situations. So we need more creative mechanisms for protecting people, and more openness and more generosity. I mean, this country, the United States, it's been shameful.
Yes, thank you for all of your work and your stories that you've told us today. I'm particularly moved by your work, all of your work, and the way that you've infused sort of these personal narratives or narratives from the migrants themselves, as well as the possibilities for humanizing through those narratives, because of the way the system is sort of based in dehumanizing migrants as faceless and people, and also the way creative art can sort of function as a way to aid in that. But I specifically wanted to ask Leisy, I was really moved by your personal narrative because of the way that, we heard a lot about Central American immigrants and people talk about them, and then you were sort of speaking back to that narrative as someone who's maybe 1.5 generation. And I was very moved by the story you were talking about of the people who are here in the U.S. speaking back to the refugees that were not sort of moved by their own narratives and the hardenedness of that. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what you learned from that and from them.
So like I mentioned at the beginning, I have been involved in all of this mostly as an activist and someone who's from this community. And so in LA, there's just a lot going on, from services to activism, political activism, and trying to provide educational opportunities and all sorts of things happening. And so I've been in these different spaces, and it always amazes me that these people who have a history of being really kick-ass activists, as formerly known dreamers, just undocumented youth or activist teachers who have really been pushing the educational agenda to be more inclusive. All these people who really knew their stuff about immigration more broadly didn't think that we needed to have a different lens or a different narrative to figure out what we do with what's happening with recently arrived Central Americans. And so I sat in a number of spaces where these conversations were going on, and they're trying to really, empower these young newcomers and trying to get them, pumped up. It's going to be great. You're going to integrate. You'll be fine. I went through the same thing, and I'm thinking, no, it's not. It's not exactly the same thing. And even, at the university level, honestly, I was amazed at some of the ways that colleagues who generally know about issues about Latinos had no idea that talking about DACA as a solution wasn't going to work here. Because Central Americans have been made, as Arely Zimmerman says, either invisible or hypervisible. We're caricatures, and so trying to figure out what to do with this group coming from a place of solidarity and really good intentions, we don't have the language, we don't have the lens. And so I saw that happen over and over with very well-intentioned people, and the message wasn't getting across because these kids, really have a lot that they're dealing with, a lot of trauma. So even, for example, I thought this was really great. This one after-school program taught them how to make films. They made short films, and they had a little film festival. And then they brought in Hilda Solis, who is was the labor secretary under Obama and a well-known politician in LA, and again, someone who's in solidarity with the workers' movement and all of this. And she just kept talking about Si se puede, and my family did it, and I just worked really hard, and it feels so disconnected and kind of empty because you're not actually getting at the reality that is very specific to this group. So there's a lot more involved in why I said that, but there's definitely a need, if we're going to do something, to recognize that we have to learn a little more about this group.
Can I just add something to that? I think that's beautifully put and very poignant. And it strikes me that the previous generation, and again, I represented a lot of those people in the 80s, we faced enormous obstacles, it's true. There was a 97% denial rate in Salvadoran cases, 98% in Guatemalan cases, Haitian cases. It was a very uphill battle. But there was nothing like the massive deportation machinery that we have now. There was no system like that. So it actually was much easier in those days to win those. I think people don't appreciate how much harder it is now. I mean, you obviously appreciate it, but I think it's part of the story is that this harsh machine has been put into place, and people just don't slip through the cracks the way they used to. It's much more efficient when they want to round people up. I mean, when you hear Trump or Cruz talking about deporting 12 million people, and other people say, oh, they couldn't possibly do that. Well, yeah, they could, actually. The machinery is there. They could do that. I'm not saying they will. And I'm voting for Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or somebody, but.
Thank you all for this fantastic panel and the previous panel, too. And you've given us so much to think about that I think will bleed into the reception discussion, into tomorrow's discussion about trauma, about temporality, and about human rights discourses and their future. But I want to come back to zero in on something that Leisy mentioned in passing about the family detention centers in Carnes and Dilley being for-profit centers. And it strikes me that we've had so much discussion so far today about individual agency and its modalities, about governmentality and its modalities, and dancing around the edge of all of this and creeping into your paper right there and creeping into Felicity's paper too, is the question about the neoliberal insertion of these profit-making enterprises that seem to, that threaten to nullify everything that those legal defenses might be able to set in place, even in your utopian vision, Daniel, of a declaration of human rights for the deported, because once you have the transformation of the deportee's body into a profit-making center, you're in another terrain altogether. So I wonder if you, and maybe even some of the people from the previous panel, want to comment on what we do with capitalism in these discussions.
We dismantle it. I mean, really, that's the answer to everything. And, in being in these spaces with people who are formerly detained and people whose relatives are detained, and they see it. They see it so clearly right away. One woman said, yo soy la gallina de los huevos de oro. I'm the hen that lays the golden eggs for this corporation where I am. Another woman, after going to visit her sister in Texas in detention, when she came back, she told me, I imagine this like big, scary place and guards and whatever, but it was like whatever security guard and then it just hit me. They're just making money here. They see it so clearly and so immediately, and I think that's part of why they've been able to organize to, question all of it, because they see how false this whole thing is. So, for me, it's also been super important to make sure that we highlight their voices, because they have the analysis, they're living it, they are organizing themselves to get attention, and because the for-profit part of this is in there, that's the hard part of working around. Even when a lot of them are released, then the same corporation who was profiting from them being in detention now profits because they have to pay them for their ankle monitors, and they have to continue to pay them a monthly fee for that or something like that.
Yeah, if I had had more time, I would have talked more about this. I think you're right. It's a very important phenomenon, and it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. I mean, there's money on the flights. There's money in the subsidies. There's money floating into this. I would say that it definitely has a corrupting influence. I don't know that it's necessarily insurmountable. I mean, we had similar tendencies that were happening early on when the government was subcontracting with various facilities, and states and counties were making money off of immigration detention. And the American Bar Association, I was on the national task force at that time, focused on that and drew a lot of attention to it. There was some litigation about it. This is a bigger phenomenon. And actually, part of the pernicious aspect of this is that if you trace this, and this would be an interesting subject for research if maybe somebody here has already done it, there's already been people who are like high up in Homeland Security who are then going to work for some of these companies and getting, you know, really big salaries and good money for doing it. So we're starting to see that revolving door problem. But I don't think it is, I'm not sure that it's yet as central an aspect. I mean, the system was really harsh and bad before people started profiting from it. I think this is an impediment to reform, but I think it can be named and shamed and criticized. Maybe, it's funny, I'm having an optimistic moment here. It's not really like me. It must be the time change with the East Coast. But I agree, it needs to be focused on. And I think there has been a fair amount of research about it, though.
Also, just kind of to add to that somewhat anecdotally, I don't know if this is happening in the US, but I know that in the UK and Ireland, for example, there's been a shift so that many asylum seekers placed in detention now, whilst they're in detention, rather than being given legal aid, which they were granted before new policies, they're actually given these self-representation notebooks so that they can represent themselves in their asylum hearings. And so these self-representation notebooks are very kind of like neoliberal in the way that they encourage the subjects to kind of represent themselves, so the kind of behavior they should exercise, they teach them what it means to be a good citizen, all these kinds of things. So we see there how it's not just economic but also cultural. It's very much kind of teaching asylum seekers who are in detention, you know, if they do get asylum, how to kind of behave and be a good consumer and a good subject, a good productive citizen, that kind of thing, while also depriving them of legal aid that they really need to be successful. So yeah, that's just, I'm not sure if that's happening in the US in the same way.
Do you have time for one more question? I take it we're out of time.
We can,
Do we have, okay,
one
more question.
One more question from Marie.
Hi, thank you for your talks. My question was for Professor Kanstroom. One comment that you said made me flinch a little. That was that we should cherish the fact that we are a nation of immigrants. And I understand how this discourse is very helpful in guaranteeing rights for the immigrants that are coming now, but it also passes a blink on the violences that were done against the native people in America before, when the first US immigrants started coming in. And so I was wondering if you could think of a way of reconciling, of recognizing the rights of current immigrants without denying the past.
Well, actually, I think that's completely true, of course. And the question is, what's an appropriate mechanism of reparation? And I was just thinking, you know, when I first started teaching immigration law, there was an old cartoon about this that we used to show of a group of Native Americans on the shore, you know, saying, "Welcome to America, you know, keep out." But also there was a story about a vice president of the United States who, well, I won't recount that. I mean, this is a deep problem. I don't mean to deny the history, of course, by saying that the idea of a nation of immigrants or the ideology of a nation of immigrants is a good thing. I would qualify to say it's a good thing as long as you're not stealing somebody else's land or invading their territory or committing genocide against them. We obviously have to recognize those historical facts. But I don't know how much we can completely undo all of that. As I say, I think it's more a matter of figuring out mechanisms of reparation, mechanisms of creating zones of sovereignty, which I think is happening much more in Canada than it is in the United States for the descendants of the people who were the victims of that. In one sense, I guess you could say it was immigration that caused all of this. But I think that's I don't know how far we can take that argument to its logical conclusion. I don't think stopping immigration now is the solution to rectifying the past, but I think you're completely right. And I did actually, what I was going to say was that in my book about the history of deportation, I actually used the example of the Cherokee as a mechanism that was analogous to deportation. What Andrew Jackson led, when he was fighting them, I don't know if you know about this particular period, that was an example of the forced movement of a group of people. It was part of the development of the deportation system that exists now, was getting used to the idea that it was legitimate to move people in that way and take them from the place where they had lived. So I think these mechanisms can be understood in a more comparative way as well. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, because your question actually in some sense goes so deep that I don't know that I can give a complete answer to it. So I'll ask my fellow panelists to join me if there's a better answer to that.
I don't have an answer either, but it's definitely something that on the ground among activists, people are really talking about how do we do this? How do we, precisely what you asked, how do we demand human rights for people who are coming now while also recognizing that we're on stolen lands, right? And I don't know that anyone has a very clear, acceptable answer all around, but it's something that people are struggling with quite a lot, because for so long we've been using this problematic frame of we're a country of immigrants, and so, let's continue that.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest the framing is unproblematic, but I do think it has elements in it that should be held on to. While we're on the subject, it's also a country that was largely built by slave labor. That's a problem that we have to deal with, too.
I think also that the refrain, we are a country of immigrants, is often offered as a response to xenophobia, racism, exclusion, deportation, what do you say, like you treat one group one way and then you treat another group another way, differing treatment, unfair treatment. In fact, yes, European settlers were also migrants, but they're often not acknowledged as such. They're European travelers, discoverers, settlers, and migrants are often poor people on the move today, like in the present. And so I think that the refrain, oh, well, we are a nation of immigrants, or, we're all immigrants, with the exception of the indigenous, is a way of, I think, responding to the fact that the migrant is it's a category that is often pejorative. Europeans still travel. They're called travelers. They're called tourists. People with money are students. They travel on tourist visas or student visas, whatever. And then we have migrants, who are basically poor people on the move, who are a problem. We need to end. It's time for our reception. I want to thank Pat Zavella for moderating this panel. I want to thank